In the spring of 2006, inside a B&Q superstore on the edge of Birmingham, a British homeowner picked up a grey cordless drill. It cost £35. On the shelf beside it, a professional tool with the same voltage cost 3 times as much. The buyer did not hesitate. The cheaper box went into the trolley. The name stamped on the plastic shell, Mac Allister, sounded entirely traditional, like a proud old Scottish forge or a legacy Sheffield toolmaker. But this brand owned no foundries. It possessed no workshops. It had never forged a single gear in Britain. It was entirely a creation of retail executives, designed on spreadsheets in London and manufactured thousands of miles away in Asia. But the real story of Mac Allister in Britain is not just the invention of a clever retail label. It is the story of how the British home improvement boom traded the workshop for the superstore, how convenience defeated craftsmanship, and how a nation that once built tools for a lifetime quietly accepted tools built for a weekend. Every week, we document the tools, factories, and workshops that once defined British industry, and what happened when modern retail rewrote the rules. Subscribe if that history matters to you. But this story begins not with a Sheffield forge, but inside the corporate boardrooms of Britain's largest DIY empire in the late 20th century. Start in the late 20th century. The traditional British ironmonger was a place of deep institutional knowledge, but it was structurally unsuited for a cultural revolution. In the heavy industrial cities, Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester, power tools were serious investments. They were kept behind glass or requested at a service counter. They were heavy, often corded, and built with domestic or European armatures designed to withstand the daily abuse of a tradesman. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the landscape of British work was shifting. The nation was transitioning from industrial manufacturing to a service economy, and an obsession with homeownership birthed a new cultural phenomenon, the weekend DIY boom. Millions of British homeowners were suddenly spending their Saturdays building garden decking, assembling flat-pack furniture, and renovating terraced houses. This new army of weekend warriors created a massive, unprecedented demand, exposing a glaring absence in the British tool market. On the shelves of the rapidly expanding retail parks, a homeowner faced a punishing financial choice. To one side sat the professional tier, brands like Makita, Bosch Professional, or DeWalt. These were engineered for the construction site, but a single drill could cost well over £150, representing a serious, often unjustifiable expense for someone who only wanted to hang a few shelves. To the other side sat the bottom-tier imports, anonymous, unbranded plastic shells sold in discount bins for £10, which smelled of burning ozone the moment the motor met resistance. There was no reliable middle ground. The market was desperate for a tool that was better than disposable, but cheaper than professional. The solution did not come from a traditional toolmaker. It came from Kingfisher plc, the vast corporate entity behind B&Q, Britain's dominant home improvement retailer. Headquartered in London, with logistics networks sprawling across the country, Kingfisher looked at the surging DIY market and recognized a fundamental shift in retail mechanics. The profit was no longer in negotiating margins with established tool factories in the Midlands or Germany. The true leverage lay in controlling the retail shelf itself. Instead of merely selling tools, the retail empire decided to become the creator of tools. They bypassed the traditional British tool room entirely and turned to the rapidly industrializing factories of Asia. This marked the aggressive acceleration of the Own Exclusive Brand, or OEB strategy. Kingfisher's executives understood the psychology of the British consumer perfectly. A name carries weight. A tool buyer in Leeds, Bristol, or Glasgow might hesitate to trust a complex mechanical device bearing an overtly foreign or generic name. They wanted a brand that felt grounded, something that implied heritage, ruggedness, and traditional engineering authority. The name Mac Allister was deployed specifically to fill this psychological need. It sounded like an old Scottish forge. It sounded like a company that had been casting iron in the damp cold of the Highlands for a century. In reality, it was a piece of corporate intellectual property, a trademark assigned to imported goods, born on a spreadsheet and executed through global supply chains. Mac Allister did not enter the British market through trade exhibitions, engineering catalogues, or the endorsement of shipyard unions. Its British entry was dictated by retail dominance. In the early 2000s, as B&Q expanded its footprint to over 300 massive superstores across the United Kingdom, Mac Allister suddenly commanded prime, eye-level shelf space. From massive retail sheds in Croydon to retail parks on the outskirts of Edinburgh, the brand bypassed the traditional tool merchant entirely. B&Q controlled the physical real estate where the British public bought their hardware, and they used that immense power to place their own creation directly into the hands of the consumer. The positioning of Mac Allister was a masterclass in market segmentation. B&Q already offered extreme budget lines, brands like Value or Performance Power, for the absolute lowest price points. Mac Allister was carefully engineered for the mid-tier. It was marketed directly at the enthusiast DIYer. The tools were styled aggressively, often using dark grays, blacks, and blues, deliberately mimicking the visual language of expensive, heavy-duty professional equipment. The retail logic was flawless. Place a substantial-looking Mac Allister 18-volt cordless drill on the shelf at £40, right next to a heavily restricted, heavily security-tagged selection of professional brands costing 3 times that amount. The contrast made the purchase feel like a victory. The early British reception was an avalanche of consumer adoption. Traditional mid-tier consumer brands, such as Black & Decker, which had relied on their own legacy manufacturing and marketing, suddenly found themselves squeezed out of the very retail chains they had historically relied upon. Why would a retail giant dedicate its most valuable shelf space to a third-party brand when it could capture the entire manufacturing and retail profit margin by selling a Mac Allister? The product inside the cardboard box was an exercise in precise, calculated compromise. The traditional British toolmaker designed a tool not to fail. The modern retail buyer designed a tool to meet a specific, acceptable lifespan. A Mac Allister drill did not need to survive 50 hours a week on a damp construction site. It only needed to survive 20 hours a year in a suburban garage. By stripping out heavy-duty bearings, using cheaper brushed motors, and relying on mass-produced battery cells, the retail empire hit a price point that made traditional tool-making irrelevant. Within a few short years, the old guarantee of a tool, the name of the maker stamped into its steel, was replaced by a new guarantee, the return policy printed on a superstore receipt. The Mac Allister drill was about to become the most common power tool in the British shed, without a single British engineer ever touching its internal gears. To understand how a brand with no factory conquered the British garage, one must look closely at the physical object itself. When a buyer in the mid-2000s opened the cardboard packaging of a Mac Allister 18-volt cordless drill, they did not find the polished steel or cast iron of a traditional Sheffield tool. They found a shell of injection-molded plastic, wrapped in aggressive, dark, over-molded rubber. The tool felt substantial in the hand, but the bulk of its weight did not come from a heavy-duty copper armature. It came from the base. This was the era of the NICD battery, a nickel-cadmium power cell, a heavy, older generation of rechargeable chemistry that provided raw electrical current, but suffered from memory effect, meaning the battery would permanently lose its maximum charge capacity if it was plugged into a wall charger before being completely empty. Inside the plastic casing, the engineering was a masterclass in calculated cost reduction. It utilized a brushed electric motor, a standard system that relies on physical carbon blocks, known as brushes, rubbing directly against the spinning rotor to transfer electrical current. It was a proven technology, but one that naturally generated heat, sparks, and inevitable friction wear. When the carbon brushes eventually ground down to nothing, the motor would die. In a professional tool, these brushes could be accessed via a port and replaced by a mechanic. In a Mac Allister, the plastic casing was often sealed with tamper-proof screws, or the internal wiring was soldered in a way that made replacing the brushes more expensive than simply replacing the entire drill. The power from this motor fed into a basic planetary gearbox, a nested sequence of interlocking gears that reduces the high spinning speed of the motor into high torque, the raw twisting force required to drive a long screw into dense timber. In legacy industrial tools, these gears were machined steel. In mid-tier retail brands, they were often a carefully engineered combination of low-grade sintered metal and heavy-duty nylon. At the front of the tool sat a keyless chuck, a rotating plastic and metal collar that allowed the user to tighten or loosen the jaws gripping the drill bit using only their hands, eliminating the need for a separate steel chuck key that was easily lost in a messy workspace. The engineering was not designed for 100,000 cycles. It was designed for a price point. And in the British market, that price point was a revelation. In 2005, a professional-grade 18-volt cordless drill from a legacy manufacturer, a tool expected to survive being dropped from a scaffolding tower on a damp, freezing construction site in Leeds, could easily cost between 130 to 180 pounds. For a professional carpenter, that was a necessary investment in their livelihood. For a suburban homeowner wanting to fix a loose garden gate, it was an insurmountable financial barrier. The Mac Allister 18-volt cordless drill hit the B&Q shelves at roughly 35 to 40 pounds. This number was not arbitrary. 40 pounds was a psychological threshold. It was significantly less than the cost of calling out a professional tradesman for a single hour of labor. It was roughly the cost of a modest family takeaway meal. At that price, the drill ceased to be a major capital investment requiring careful consideration. It became a disposable convenience. A homeowner could buy the Mac Allister, use it to assemble a bedroom wardrobe, put it in the damp shed for 6 months, and feel they had already received their money's worth. If the tool eventually failed to charge 2 years later, the financial loss was negligible. The true breakthrough of Mac Allister did not happen in a testing laboratory. It happened on the floor of the British retail superstore. Traditional British toolmakers relied on a fragmented network of independent hardware shops and thick industrial catalogs to reach their buyers. Mac Allister bypassed this entirely. Kingfisher plc leveraged its massive physical footprint to create a distribution bottleneck. In massive retail warehouses like B&Q Trafford Park in Manchester or the sprawling B&Q complex at Cribbs Causeway near Bristol, Mac Allister drills were not kept behind locked glass cabinets or requested at a service counter. They were stacked high on wooden pallets directly in the main aisles. They were placed in end cap displays at the exact moment a customer was walking towards the timber and screws section. The tool was sold not as a piece of specialist machinery, but as an essential accessory to the project itself. This retail gravity pulled in specific segments of the British public. First came the suburban weekend DIY-ers, millions of homeowners attempting bold renovations inspired by a tidal wave of home improvement television programs. Second came the flat-pack furniture buyers. As European retail giants expanded across Britain, the manual screwdriver became agonizingly slow, making a cheap cordless drill a household necessity. Third came independent, local handymen, the sole traders operating out of small vans in towns across the Midlands and the North. While these tradesmen kept expensive, professional corded tools for heavy masonry work, many began buying Mac Allister Cordless Drills as cheap, secondary backup tools. If a cheap drill fell off a ladder and shattered on a concrete driveway, it was a 40-pound write-off, rather than a catastrophic business loss. Finally, local property management agencies and maintenance crews began stocking them in utility cupboards for quick, light-duty repairs, where professional equipment was overkill. What competitors could not replicate was the retail moat that Kingfisher built around the battery. The heavy NICD battery block at the base of the Mac Allister drill was designed to be proprietary. Once a British homeowner bought the drill, they owned the battery and the charging dock. When summer arrived and they needed a hedge trimmer, or when they decided to lay a laminate floor and needed a circular saw, the Mac Allister bare tool, sold without a battery in the box, was astonishingly cheap. The buyer was locked into the ecosystem. They returned to the B&Q Superstore, not because Mac Allister possessed the finest forged steel in Britain, but because the battery sitting on their workbench dictated their next purchase. The name stamped onto the plastic was not a guarantee of lifelong durability. It was a specification of retail convenience. The peak of Mac Allister in Britain was not recorded in a trade journal or celebrated in an engineering hall. It was recorded in the changing landscape of the British weekend. By the late 2000s, a cultural phenomenon had completely rewritten how the nation interacted with tools. It was the era of the bank holiday DIY project. Across new housing developments in Milton Keynes, Victorian terraces in London, sprawling commuter towns outside Leeds, and suburban garages in Birmingham, millions of homeowners were taking on renovations that would have previously been left to local tradesmen. This was driven by a booming property market, an explosion of home improvement television programs, and the relentless nationwide expansion of flat-pack furniture. As European furniture giants opened massive retail warehouses across the United Kingdom, the manual screwdriver became an agonizingly slow limitation. Putting together a single wardrobe required driving 40 or 50 screws. Assembling an entire bedroom suite required hundreds. The British consumer desperately needed a motorized solution, and Kingfisher plc was perfectly positioned to provide it. To understand the sheer scale of Mac Allister's dominance, one must look at the physical real estate it occupied. By 2010, B&Q operated over 330 vast superstores across the country. In the cavernous retail sheds of Trafford Park in Manchester, the sprawling B&Q complex at Cribbs Causeway near Bristol, the massive multi-story outlet in New Malden, London, and the retail parks of Hermiston Gate in Edinburgh, Mac Allister did not just occupy a shelf. It commanded entire aisles. It was stacked on bulk wooden pallets right by the entrance doors. It was placed on promotional end caps facing the timber yards. The traditional British ironmonger had sold tools by offering expert advice, pulling a specific item from a drawer, and discussing its merits across a wooden counter. B&Q sold Mac Allister through sheer visual overwhelming force. A customer walking in to buy a tin of emulsion paint or a bag of garden compost would be confronted by a wall of black, gray, and blue plastic. The true genius of the brand's expansion, however, was not just in selling a single drill. It was the deployment of the cordless ecosystem. The heavy 18-volt nickel-cadmium battery pack that came in the box was designed to be modular. Once a British homeowner owned that battery and its dedicated charging station, the retail trap was set. When summer arrived and that same homeowner needed to build a garden fence, they returned to the B&Q Superstore. They did not need to buy a brand new, expensive kit. They could buy a Mac Allister circular saw as a bare tool, a unit sold in a plain cardboard box without a battery or charger for an astonishingly low price, perhaps 25 or 30 pounds. This ecosystem logic spread the brand like a virus through the British shed. A customer who initially only wanted to hang a mirror soon found themselves owning a Mac Allister jigsaw, a Mac Allister detail sander, and a Mac Allister impact driver. The battery became the anchor that kept the consumer returning to the same retail chain year after year. This aggressive expansion devastated the traditional mid-tier tool market in Britain. Legacy consumer brands that had dominated the 1980s and 90s, brands like Black & Decker or the green-cased domestic line of Bosch, suddenly found themselves fighting a losing battle. They were attempting to sell tools through B&Q while competing directly against B&Q's own in-house creation. The retail giant controlled the pricing, the shelf position, the promotional flyers, and the checkout displays. If a legacy brand offered a drill for £60, B&Q could instantly place a Mac Allister drill with equivalent printed specifications right next to it for £40, capturing the entire margin. Consequently, millions of traditional corded power tools, old British-made Wolf drills, early Black & Decker models with metal gear casings, and heavy-duty European imports were quietly retired. They were pushed to the back of the garage, replaced by the convenience of the cordless plastic shell. The Mac Allister drill became the ubiquitous symbol of British homeownership. It was the tool a father bought for his son when he moved into his first flat. It was the backup tool kept in the vans of local handymen, property management agencies, and maintenance crews in cities across the nation. The sheer volume of this retail operation fundamentally redefined British hardware logistics. In the past, tool distribution relied on regional wholesalers sending small, carefully packed wooden crates from factories in Sheffield or the Midlands to local ironmongers. Mac Allister drills did not arrive in small batches. They arrived in thousands of corrugated shipping containers at the deep-water ports of Felixstowe and Southampton, shipped directly from outsourced megafactories in Shenzhen and Jiangsu. Kingfisher's centralized distribution hubs processed these power tools not as specialist engineering equipment, but as high-volume, fast-moving consumer goods. They were managed on the same logistical spreadsheets as rolls of loft insulation, flat-pack kitchen cabinets, and bags of tile adhesive. The success of the tool was proved in its daily application. On a damp October weekend in a terraced garden in Nottingham, where driving 100 4-inch steel screws into wet decking timber by hand would take hours and blister the skin, the 18-volt Mac Allister could sink every fastener before the winter rain started. The balance of the tool was not perfect. The plastic casing might flex slightly under heavy pressure, and the motor would run hot if pushed too hard. But the tool completed the job, and the battery survived the afternoon. For the British homeowner, that was the only metric that mattered. This practical sufficiency allowed Mac Allister to cross the boundary from domestic DIY into the professional trades. In small-scale fabrication shops in the Black Country, or among maintenance teams servicing sprawling university campuses in Leeds and Manchester, the grey and black plastic drills began appearing on workbenches alongside heavy-duty Makita and DeWalt systems. The Mac Allister became the universal sacrificial tool. It was the drill handed to the new apprentice, the tool left in the back of the damp transit van overnight, or the unit used for rough, dirty work where dropping it into a puddle of wet cement would only mean a 40-pound loss, rather than a financial catastrophe for the business. While exact production figures for Kingfisher's individual own exclusive brand lines remain closely guarded corporate data, industry estimates from the period suggest a staggering saturation of the British market. By the early 2010s, during the peak of the property renovation boom, available reports indicate that a Mac Allister power tool was present in roughly 1 out of every 3 residential garages in the United Kingdom. It had achieved a level of household ubiquity that legacy British brands like Record or Britool had taken 50 years to build, and it had done so in less than a decade. At its absolute height, the Mac Allister 18-volt drill defined the atmosphere of the modern British domestic workshop. Under the flickering fluorescent light of a suburban shed, it sat squarely on the workbench. The dark plastic casing was inevitably scuffed, the rubber overmolding dusted with sawdust and brick dust. The heavy NICD battery block clicked into the base with a hollow plastic snap. The name stamped on the side did not carry the weight of a century-old Sheffield forge, but it carried the immediate, practical promise that the weekend project would be finished. The tragedy of Mac Allister in the British market is fundamentally different from the collapse of traditional manufacturing empires. Brands like Record, Britool, and Rabone Chesterman fell because their domestic factories could no longer compete with the global market. Their factories closed, their workforces were scattered. But Mac Allister did not die. It thrived. The tragedy was not the death of the brand. It was the death of the British culture of repair that the brand's success left in its wake. The turning point did not occur in a boardroom, but in millions of damp British sheds and garages roughly 3 to 4 years after the initial purchase. The mechanism of failure was built directly into the technology that had made the tool so affordable. The heavy, 18-volt nickel-cadmium battery packs that powered the Mac Allister ecosystem were chemically finite. NICD technology was robust, but it suffered severely from memory effect, a chemical limitation where a battery loses its maximum energy capacity if it is repeatedly recharged before being completely empty. In the hands of a weekend DIYer who would use the drill for 10 minutes, put it on the charger, and leave it in a freezing shed until the next bank holiday. These batteries degraded rapidly. By the early 2010s, a vast, silent wave of mechanical failure swept across the British suburbs. A homeowner in Sheffield or Birmingham would pick up their Mac Allister drill to fix a loose floorboard. They would pull the variable speed trigger. The chuck would rotate slowly, emit a low mechanical whine, and stop. The battery was completely dead, permanently unable to hold a charge. Historically, when a British tool failed, the worker relied on a well-established infrastructure of maintenance. If an old cast-iron bench vise cracked a jaw, a replacement could be ordered. If an old corded Wolf power drill or an early metallic Black & Decker began to spark, the owner took it to an independent repair shop, often found in the light industrial estates of towns like Walsall, Coventry, or Leeds. An electrician would open the metal casing, diagnose a burnt-out copper armature or worn carbon brushes, and simply swap the broken component. The tool would return to the workbench, ready for another decade of service. But the Mac Allister drill was a product of 2 overlapping structural shifts: technological and trade shift, and retail consolidation and DIY chain pressure. It was never designed to be opened. When a homeowner attempted to fix their broken drill, they discovered the harsh reality of the outsourced tool market. First, they looked for the screws. Often the dark gray plastic casing was sealed with proprietary, tamper-proof Torx screws. star-shaped fasteners featuring a central pin specifically designed to prevent a standard screwdriver from opening the shell. If the owner managed to bypass the screws and split the casing, they found a system that defied repair. The internal wiring was not connected with modular, easily replaceable terminal clips. It was permanently soldered. The brushed motor and the planetary gearbox were housed within a single sealed plastic module. There was no way to simply extract the worn carbon brushes. There were no spare parts listed in any catalog. The retreat of the British repair network was absolute. Independent hardware shops and local ironmongers could not order a new gear assembly for a Mac Allister drill because Kingfisher plc did not operate a traditional spare parts division for its mid-tier private labels. The retail giant was not in the business of maintaining 50-penny replacement springs. It was in the business of shifting shipping containers full of completely new units. Defeated by the sealed plastic casing, the British consumer was forced back to the retail ecosystem that had trapped them in the first place. They returned to the massive B&Q superstores in Croydon, Trafford Park, or Hermiston Gate, carrying their dead, heavy NICD battery, looking for a replacement. It was at the retail shelf that the final, brutal logic of the modern tool industry revealed itself. Kingfisher's pricing matrix was designed to make maintenance economically irrational. The homeowner would find a single replacement 18-volt Mac Allister battery hanging on a pegboard. The price for this single battery might be £30. Directly below it, stacked high on a promotional end cap, was a brand new Mac Allister Cordless Drill kit. The kit included a new drill, a new charger, and 2 new batteries, completely sealed in plastic. The price for the entire new kit on a bank holiday weekend promotion was £35. The math was inescapable. To repair the old tool was a financial mistake. To discard it and buy entirely new manufacturing was the only logical choice the market allowed. This pricing disparity was the direct result of cheap imports and private labels. By manufacturing tools at staggering scale in Shenzhen and shipping them via global logistics networks, the retail empire had driven the cost of a complete, assembled power tool down to the price of raw materials. The tool was no longer an asset. It was a consumable. The homeowner in the superstore aisle looked at the 30-pound replacement battery, looked at the 35-pound new kit, and made the decision that fundamentally ended the British tradition of tool-making. They put the new box in their trolley. The final stage of this decline was not driven by a lack of demand, but by a forced technological obsolescence. As the 210s progressed, the global power tool industry began a rapid transition away from the heavy, inefficient nickel-cadmium power cells. The new standard was lithium-ion technology, a battery chemistry that was significantly lighter, held its charge for months on a cold shelf, and completely eliminated the dreaded memory effect. It was an undeniable engineering leap. Kingfisher plc naturally upgraded the Mac Allister line to keep pace with the market. They introduced a brand new generation of 18-volt lithium-ion drills, wrapped in sleeker plastic, boasting better torque and longer run times. But this upgrade contained a devastating structural catch for the British consumer. The physical connection terminal, the plastic rails and metal contact points where the battery slid into the base of the tool, was completely redesigned. The new lithium-ion batteries did not fit the older generation of Mac Allister tools. For the millions of British homeowners who had bought into the original Mac Allister ecosystem, this was a catastrophic retail betrayal. A weekend DIY-er in Nottingham might own a perfectly functional Mac Allister circular saw, a jigsaw, and a detail sander, all bought cheaply as bare tools, because they shared the same original battery as the drill. But the moment that single, original NICD battery finally refused to hold a charge, the entire collection of tools became instantly useless. Because the old batteries were no longer being manufactured or stocked by the superstore, and the new batteries had a different physical shape, the consumer was trapped. They could not repair the old battery. They could not buy a new battery to fit the old tools. The retail logic of the superstore offered only one solution: throw the entire collection away and buy into the new lithium-ion ecosystem from scratch. This technological and trade shift fundamentally altered the physical landscape of British waste. In previous decades, a broken tool was an anomaly, something to be salvaged or scavenged for parts. By the middle of the 2000s, municipal council recycling centres, the local tips in cities like Leeds, Bristol, Sheffield, and Glasgow, were overflowing with small domestic appliances. In the electronic waste skips, sitting among broken kettles and obsolete televisions, were millions of grey and blue Mac Allister drills, alongside their bare tool companions. The motors inside these discarded tools were often still perfectly viable. The planetary gearboxes, though made of cheap sintered metal, were often completely unbroken. The plastic casings had barely a scratch. They were thrown away simply because the plastic rails on a replacement power block had been designed half an inch too wide to fit. This represented the absolute death of the British heirloom tool. For over a century, the defining characteristic of a British hand tool, a record bench vise, a Marple's chisel, or a Britool spanner, was generational permanence. A tool was purchased by a tradesman, used for 30 years, and then handed down to a son or an apprentice. The tool carried the physical memory of the work. But a Mac Allister cordless drill could not be handed down. A father could not give his son a power tool with a dead, irreplaceable battery. The generational link between the British worker and their tools was entirely severed by the limits of outsourced battery chemistry. The traditional British ironmonger, the local hardware shop, and the independent repairman could do nothing to stop this. They had already been hollowed out by retail consolidation. They could not compete with B&Q's pricing, and they had no access to the proprietary supply chains in Shenzhen. The culture of maintenance simply evaporated. When a tool broke, the British public no longer asked, "Where can I get this fixed?" They asked, "How much is a new one?" The transition was complete. Kingfisher plc had successfully trained an entire nation to treat complex motorized engineering as a fast-moving consumer good. The traditional toolmakers of Sheffield and Birmingham had built empires on the promise that their steel would never break. The modern retail empire built its dominance on the absolute certainty that its plastic would eventually fail, and that the customer would simply return to the aisle to buy it again. The old repair network collapsed. The independent ironmonger disappeared. The battery lost its charge. The plastic shell was sealed. The screws could not be turned. The old ecosystem was abandoned. The spare parts did not exist. The new models filled the shelf. The broken drill was discarded. The shipping containers arrived. The cycle repeated itself. No one tried to fix it. The British workshop changed forever. The brand name Mac Allister did not die. It did not require a corporate rescue, and it was not acquired by a foreign conglomerate looking to strip its heritage. Because it was entirely a creation of retail logic, it simply adapted to the next retail cycle. Today, the name remains a cornerstone of the British home improvement market. Walk into a B&Q superstore in London, Bristol, or Edinburgh this weekend, and you will still find Mac Allister power tools occupying premium aisle space. The dark gray plastic has been updated to sleeker, modern designs. The heavy nickel-cadmium batteries have been entirely replaced by lightweight lithium-ion technology. The brand continues to sell in staggering volumes, quietly building the garden fences and assembling the flat-pack wardrobes of a completely new generation of British homeowners. But the legacy of those early, mid-2000s drills reveals a profound shift in the British preservation community. When an old Sheffield-made Marples chisel or a Birmingham-forged King Dick spanner finally leaves the hands of a retiring tradesman, it enters a vibrant secondary market. Tool collectors, local historians, and traditional woodworkers actively hunt for these items at car boot sales, in antique centers, and on digital auction sites. They are restored, oiled, and put back to work, revered as physical proof of British industrial supremacy. There is no collector's market for a 2006 Mac Allister Cordless Drill. You will not find them carefully preserved in the glass display cabinets of the Kelham Island Museum in Sheffield. You will not find online forum threads dedicated to restoring their sintered planetary gearboxes. When they appear at a weekend car boot sale in a damp field outside Leeds or Manchester, they are usually piled into a cardboard box, offered for £2 or £3, and completely ignored by passers-by. Without a functioning battery and a compatible charging dock, they are not considered tools. They are considered inert plastic waste. The physical object holds no historical romance, because the object was never designed to be historic. Yet the original tool still matters because it forced a complete re-evaluation of what a tool was actually supposed to be. For over 50 years, the British hardware industry believed that a drill had to be an heirloom, a heavy, corded, over-engineered piece of machinery with a domestic copper armature that could survive a lifetime of abuse. Mac Allister proved that for the vast majority of the British public, this level of engineering was entirely unnecessary. A tool did not need to last 50 years. It only needed to last until the bank holiday project was finished. The Mac Allister drill was the perfect, hyper-efficient answer to a question the traditional toolmakers had refused to ask. What happens when the homeowner only wants to pay £40? The physical site of this industrial history is not an abandoned red brick factory with a collapsed roof and shattered windows. The physical site is the retail park itself. The sprawling B&Q warehouses in retail estates across the United Kingdom stand as the ultimate victors of the British tool wars. They are not places of manufacturing. They are cathedrals of logistics, processing shipping containers from outsourced factories and converting them directly into consumer convenience. The old workshops of the Midlands went quiet, replaced by the relentless hum of the barcode scanner at the checkout till. There is, however, one surprise footnote in the history of the early Mac Allister drill, a quiet rebellion occurring inside modern British sheds. In recent years, a small, dedicated subculture of amateur engineers and 3D printing hobbyists have refused to throw their old, perfectly functional Mac Allister drill bodies into the electronic waste skip. Using desktop 3D printers, they are designing and manufacturing custom plastic adapters. These adapters slide into the obsolete NICD battery slots of the old drills, allowing them to accept modern, currently available lithium-ion batteries from completely different brands. It is a strange, modern form of British repair culture. The retail empire engineered the original battery connection to become obsolete, so the consumer engineered their own bypass to keep the plastic shell working. Ultimately, the story of Mac Allister in Britain is the story of a trade-off. The nation gained unprecedented access to affordable, highly capable power tools, democratizing home improvement and allowing millions to build, fix, and create. But the price of that convenience was the death of permanence. What this brand's massive success reveals is the profound gap between what people say they value: durability, repairability, and traditional craftsmanship. And what the market actually rewards at the retail shelf: aggressive pricing, modular convenience, and the absolute acceptance of the disposable. When a work culture built on repair is replaced by a retail culture built on replacement, the connection between the worker and the tool is permanently broken. The tool ceases to be a partner in the work. It becomes just another consumable item on a shopping list. Somewhere in a damp suburban shed on the outskirts of Birmingham, a gray Mac Allister Cordless Drill from 2006 sits pushed to the very back of a wooden shelf, its battery permanently dead, waiting silently to be thrown into a municipal recycling skip. And in the metal drawer directly beneath it, a forged steel spanner stamped with an old Sheffield name waits in the dark, still perfectly capable of turning a bolt, ready for one more job. See you in the next one.